Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to a new programming year here at the Congregational Library and Archives. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director here. Welcome to today's virtual book talk, Lineage, Genealogy, and the Power of Connection in Early America, with Dr. Karin Wulf. And I would say I'm so excited to start our season with this book, one of the most anticipated books coming out in early America. Just came out this summer, and this was the earliest we could get Dr. Wulf onto our schedule. So to begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our own New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and really anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I invite you to check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. And with that, please allow me to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Karin Wulf is the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library and professor of history at Brown University. A historian of early America focused on gender, family, and politics, she writes widely for both public and academic audiences about history, the worlds of scholarship and scholarly publishing, and libraries and archives. You, of course, are all here today to hear more about lineage, genealogy, and the power of connection in 18th century British North America, and we are so glad for you to be here. And I see that you're also an incoming vice president of the American Historical Association. So let me thank you for not only running an archive and writing a fantastic book, but also for your service to the field. So thank you so much, Karin, for being here.
Thank you, Kyle. It is really great to be with all of you. Thank you so much for being here and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this research, which I love so much. As you'll hear, I kind of can't stop doing it even now that the book is actually a real thing and really between covers. So I'm grateful to the CLA for this invitation, and I've also, of course, used the resources of the Congressional Library and Archives. And in fact, I've included an item in my slideshow that you will see in just a moment. So I wrote this book because I wanted people to have the opportunity to think a little bit differently about genealogy. And as I'll explain a little bit further on in this talk, and I should say also, I'm going to try to talk for about 35 minutes, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I know in the course of doing presentations about this book, I've so enjoyed the opportunity to hear from people. I wanted people to have a chance to think about genealogy, not only as a leisure activity or even as a professional disciplinary approach, but also as a really foundational way of thinking about American society and politics. And as you'll hear, this is what I saw in the research that I was uncovering. The second piece that I was really committed to here is to see and understand family history, not just the history of individual families, but family history writ large as a critically important dimension of American history. I think historians are pretty good about writing histories of politics and war and economics, but we haven't been as good about writing about some of the other really foundational things that shape not only individual lives, but also structure our society. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the premises of the book. I'm going to show you some of the research from different regional and other contexts. And then, as I said, we'll get on with questions. So let's just start right here, which is to say that genealogy is and was everywhere in early America. And fair acknowledgement here, when I say early America, I'm actually talking about 18th century British America. So the scope of this book is roughly the long 18th century, kind of 1680 to 1820-ish. And in British America, on the continent, really kind of Georgia to Maine, and I worked hard across those places. Although you'll see there's a density of focus on some Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Virginia among them. So genealogy is and was everywhere. The materials that you see on this slide really just are a bare suggestion of the kinds and richness of the materials that I worked with as I was researching this book. And the cover of the book is meant to gesture at the different types of materials I worked with. Textual materials, of course, visual materials, also objects like gravestones. This stuff was truly, truly everywhere. And honestly, once you start to see it, you kind of can't unsee it. Or at least I could not unsee it and kind of can't stop seeing it. Usually when I'm giving a presentation and I'm visiting someplace, I make sure that I have time to go into the library or the special collections department of a library and do just a couple hours more work. This is obviously beyond when the book is already in publication, it's already out, it's a done thing. But I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to reflect on this phenomenon. And so I have an Instagram account called Vernacular Genealogy, which is also one of the chapters of the book where I talk about all the different ways that people approached articulating their family relationships. Genealogy is accounts of ancestry and also accounts of family connection. And these genealogies were written, they were drawn, they were spoken, they were reiterated, they were given in testimony, they were sometimes thrown as accusations or embraced in all kinds of different forms and formats in different textual material and even performative contexts. This one is from just up the road in just north of Boston in Newbury. This, I think, is an example of what we might think of as a kind of classic early 19th century family record image. It's a beautiful watercolor. And I want to point to something significant that's happening here in this genealogy of Joseph Stanwood's family. The first is that there are 3 marriages represented here and 10 children of those 3 marriages. Of those children, you can see that there is a little coffin down there, 9 children, sorry, 9 children. But there's a little coffin down below. And one of those 10 children, one of the babies died. So there's 9 living children and 1 who is deceased. But the other thing is those 2 coffins on either side represent the 2 women who died. It's really interesting to see how early Americans represented the complexity of family relationships, including multiple marriages in an era when women did often die in childbirth. I think sometimes when we think about genealogy or family records, we think about textual records rather than those kind of visual forms, which became really popular in the late 18th and early 19th century. But when we think of kind of classics, we think about this kind of early textual form. And sometimes we think about Bible records, and I'm going to get to that in a minute and talk about why Bible records were really not the singular place for the location of family records in the 18th century. But this kind of family record was much more common, and I came across, dozens of these that are extant in libraries and archives, and I'm sure there are many, many, many more that are kept as treasures in families' own private collections or private hands. This one was written by Hannah Waterman just south of me in Warwick, Rhode Island in early 1770s. As you can see with my little pencil there for scale, this was a really small and intimate object. It would have easily fit into her pocket. That is the pocket that she wore. And it is rough sewn. She hand sewed the pages together. It's just a handful of pages stitched there. And in this beautiful little book, what Hannah Waterman included was an account of her family, including her father, who had died when she was a baby. He was a ship's captain and he died of illness in Suriname. But her father and an account of her parents' marriage. You can see in this object that sometimes she is actually, we can tell she was copying something from a previous family record because the pen, the voice is actually her father's voice describing, I married Hannah's mother. And then Hannah goes on to list all of her siblings, their births, and also their deaths. She had lost a number of her siblings, some when they were babies and others later. For example, Edward Waterman, her brother, who was also like her father, on the sea, and he sailed and remains unheard of as of 1770. Very poignant. When Hannah Waterman wrote this family record, this account of all of her siblings and her parents and so on, she was writing in the moment of intense grief. In January of 1770, it was just a couple of months since she had lost her mother, her closest sister, and her sister's baby daughter. So, like many actually genealogical products of this period, it is, in a sense, a grief memorial. This is an example that I pulled from the Congregational Library just to demonstrate how often in court records we see genealogies and family relationships described. In this case, it's about a dispute over a grandfather's inheritance and how that could be divided among the children of two siblings. So that's a guardians of Sam and George Corwin, and the children of Mr. George Corwin promising to engage and pay these others who promised to drop this suit. It's important when we think about genealogies in the 18th century, not only to look at what families were producing about themselves, but about how the public record of genealogy was being developed. This is a really important theme throughout the book, is how we understand that genealogy came to be a really dense, what we might call now, field of data in the 18th century. So what you see at the top there, and this is in the same year that Hannah Waterman was writing just south of me, and this is happening just down the road from me here in Providence. In 1770, this is John Field and Mercy Searle's 1770 marriage certificate attested by the minister of the Congregational Church there. But significantly, just on the other side of that little slip of paper is the note from the town clerk, James Angel, who recorded their marriage in the town records. And indeed, I've gone to look at the book of records to see that indeed James Angel did record their marriage right there. I think sometimes we see, as historians or as family historians, we may look at the town records or maybe transcription of the town records that are on Ancestry, for example, and we see the note about the date that someone married, but we don't always see the process by which it got there. And it's quite important, this little slip of paper. There aren't as many of these extant as you might think, but it's very important to see that process, that process starts with one official making that statement, yes, this thing happened, and I need to push it along to you, the clerk of the town, so that you make sure that you record that information. That's how this thick public record of family relationships came to be. Now, another thing that was interesting and important to me to look at is how we understand different kinds of denominational and regional interests in creating genealogy. And because I had started as a historian of the Mid-Atlantic, I had started as a historian, my first work really focused on some Quaker women who were writers in 18th century Philadelphia. I was familiar with Quaker records, and in fact, it was the Quaker practice of starting to do genealogical work in the 18th century that caught my attention initially, and that I felt like I just couldn't understand what it is that they were doing. Why are they doing all this genealogical research in the 18th century? I thought genealogy was like a 19th century phenomenon. And by the way, don't these people know that in the 18th century, this is the age of individualism and meritocracy, and it's the American Revolution, and they're not supposed to be obsessing about ancestry. So I became really interested in understanding that Quaker practice of genealogy. And there's an important thing to understand about that Quaker practice of creating that public record of family relationships, which is that it really had its origins in the origins of the denomination of Quakerism itself, which is to say that the founders of Quakerism understood how important it was for them to make records and have those records on hand and have those records witnessed, because they wanted to be sure that their marriages, for example, were legitimated, and thus their children's births were legitimated, and thus their children would be able to inherit property. Without a recognition of the legitimacy of those marriages, thus those children would be imperiled. So right from the beginning, George Fox and Margaret Fell, the founders of Quakerism in the 17th century Britain, were saying, make sure you keep records. So you can see in this case, I'm showing you two different versions of birth certificates. One, a printed form that was then filled out in manuscript there from 1721, and the other just a manuscript notation from some family records that also 18th century of births. One thing that's interesting to me about the one you see on the bottom there, this is one extended family, by the way. There's a lot to say about this one extended family, and I've written a lot about them and their genealogical work. But an interesting thing to note about this is that the midwife's name is also noted there. So you can see her name there, Mary Sindri, and I see her in other records too. Among that family, an interesting way to get a quickish look at a phenomenon that I saw in lots of different places was this particular family history scrapbook. This scrapbook, created by Joseph Parker Norris in the late 18th century, combined materials that his family had been collecting and that his grandparents and aunts and uncles and great-grandparents even had been collecting, and combined that stuff from the 17th century, the mid 18th century, and then his own contemporary late 18th century, and cut and pasted these things into this scrapbook. That kind of aggregation of family record keeping that is so obvious in this scrapbook, and these scrapbooks are beautiful. They're rather enormous, about 3 of them. But when you turn them, you see how many different chronological moments of family history interest are represented. And that kind of subsequent generations of family history work across the 18th century is something that I saw in lots of different places and by lots of different groups. It is so visually obvious in this particular case. And there were lots of different kinds of things that were collected here. So there's a note there, one woman, 1767, you'll see in the upper left of that, my dear sister Debbie Norris departed this life. That's just one of the times when that woman, Elizabeth Norris, wrote about her sister's death. She wrote about it a lot. There are family accounts there, who's born, who died. And then there are also some surprising things that show up in this family scrapbook that give us an insight sometimes into just family gatherings. This was a family weigh-in at an event in 1755. Who knows why they chose to do this, but they accounted each one of those family members. The second person that you see there, Polly Norris, that's Mary Norris Dickinson. She goes on to marry John Dickinson anyway, but when she was just a little girl, not even a teenager yet. So one wonders, right? But you can see there some evidence of family fun in this genealogical scrapbook as well. So one of the points that I make in the book, and really a kind of predicate for my work, is that genealogy may seem to us like a universal practice and interest, that people across time and space are interested in their family relationships and find ways of articulating those family relationships. And it is almost true that it seems a universal interest and expression. But what's also true is that the form of that interest and the form of those articulations is quite historically specific. That is, from culture to culture and across generations, the specific form that genealogy takes is really specific and revealing. And that's part of why when I write about genealogy in 18th century British America, this isn't just about genealogy that could be happening at any time in American history or at any place in the 18th century. It's very particular to British America. So what is it that makes genealogy in this moment British American? Well, I argue that there are kind of 3 dimensions to this, and I'm really generalizing here and summarizing, and but the short version is that British American genealogy really reflects a deep interest in and investment in a patriarchal and patrilineal society. And that is in part based in Protestantism. It's in part, deeply biblical. I think many of us can understand that the Bible itself is a very genealogical text, and it's not just because of all those begats in the Old Testament. There are other ways in which the Old Testament reflects kind of thinking about lineage as this really important form of authority, but also in the New Testament, where Jesus's descent from the house of David is a really important part of that story. But many other ways in which Protestantism itself is arranged around emphasizing genealogy and emphasizing lineage, sometimes down to birthright membership in denominations, but there are other dimensions to Protestant practice that reiterate and emphasize that biblical emphasis on lineage. The monarchy itself, of course, is a foundationally genealogical institution. And although we might think about all the ways that the monarchy had to sidestep strict lineal relationships, if we think about from the Tudors to the Stuarts to the Hanovers, that's a pretty bumpy road there. But it is still the case that when the first Hanoverian king comes to the throne, George I in 1714, he still has to explain why his authority derives from his relationship, in this case, to a grandmother, Sophia of Hanover. So the monarchy finds ways to emphasize the authority of that lineal structure. And one of those is in something that would have been obvious to anyone living in British America, which is the use of heraldry and the incredible imagery of the coats of arms that would have been in the visual field of most people in any town or county or city, certainly where there was a public building. The king's coat of arms would have been there. People would have understood the royal supporters, the lion and the unicorn, and what those meant, and so on. And then lastly, the law. The law in British America is such a foundationally genealogical kind of structure, is so much about property, and so much of what Blackstone writes about property is about the ability for people to not only own property, but to convey it through inheritance. So Blackstone is, I think to the surprise of many people who haven't thought about it this way regularly, Blackstone is really a lot about genealogy. When you open the volume of Blackstone around property, you see there are these extraordinary family trees laid out, and chapter after chapter after chapter of describing family relationships so you can understand inheritance. So if I'm right about all of that, that genealogy was all over the place and that it's so important, why on earth is it that this is the first book to kind of make that point? If I just become entranced by this topic, that's entirely possible. But I think there's another explanation here, which is to do with the way that genealogy has been understood and has been characterized and often caricatured, frankly, as a topic. And here I pick on someone who can certainly bear it, which is the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer Ron Chernow, who's in the very first page, literally the first sentence of his biography of George Washington, for which he won the Pulitzer. Chernow says that the crowded career of George Washington allowed him little leisure to indulge his vanity or gratify his curiosity by conducting genealogical research into his family. That's literally the first sentence of Chernow's biography, except it's dead wrong. George Washington left very little archival material to document his young life, but this, among the 300 enormous red leather-bound folio volumes of George Washington's papers at the Library of Congress, this little piece of paper is one of them. George Washington wrote this family tree when he was between 16 and 18 years old, and I know that because of the people who were included on this family tree, his little nieces, who are the last names there, Jane, Fairfax, and Mildred. George Washington was really particular about this. This shows 6 generations of Washingtons, beginning with his great-great-grandparents, John and Anne Pope Washington. There's George himself. And I want to back up and just point out that way over on the left in the penultimate line there, you see Butler, the name Butler. That's little Butler Washington, who was born in 1716 and also died in 1716, died as an infant, 16 years before George Washington was born, which tells you that George Washington was doing a very careful job of sketching out this family tree and his relationship one to the other. Fast forward into the 1790s, and the chief herald of the College of Arms in London, Sir Isaac Hurd, had written to George Washington, surely thinking like, okay, Washington is president. You know, if you're going to be a powerful political leader, surely there must be some kind of lineage authority here that we should be thinking about, and maybe we should do, you know, George Washington's pedigree. This, what you're looking at right now, is material from the research notebooks of Sir Isaac Hurd at the College of Arms. So he did all of this work on George Washington, and then he sent a version of this. Picture that you see here is from the version that he sent to Washington, and that's in Washington's papers at the Library of Congress, with some interesting little elisions there. I would love to speculate about that. But so when Sir Isaac Hurd wrote to George Washington, Washington then turned around immediately and wrote to others of his family members to say, hey, he's asking me for information. Because what Isaac Hurd said was, I know a lot about the English side. I'm a really good researcher and I've got lots of great material and I can fill that out a little bit. But I need you to tell me more about the Virginia family. And so Washington writes to some of his cousins and other people saying, you know, I know there's some more family papers that you have. I want you to just tell me these particular details. So he starts doing what I've seen lots of other people doing, which is more family research. He already had a foundation in it. And here you just see that's Washington docketing some of his ongoing correspondence. So that's by 1798. So he's really, this is a longstanding correspondence with the College of Arms about the Washington pedigree. But the thing that's remarkable about that piece of the family tree, that little piece of paper that I showed you, is multifold. One is that I think Washington probably wrote this description on that piece of paper, which was folded in thirds. When you see it again, you'll see it's got these fold marks. Could have been folded in thirds and then poked into the cubbies in Washington study. And the very kind folks at Mount Vernon let me create a facsimile of this object and fold it, and before they opened for the day some summers ago, and tuck it in there just to make sure I was right about the sizing there. But he wrote that genealogy of the Washington family in Virginia. But the other thing is, here's the one side that you've already seen of that family tree. And here's the other side of that piece of paper, which is a list of tithables, people who were enslaved by the Washington family and on whom the Washingtons would pay a tax. These people were part of the estate of Washington's father and his brother, and he probably wrote this piece of the paper in 1752 when they had just died. You can see that's where his father, and that's where George is coming from his brother. Then he becomes that's who he's inheriting from. But that object, the single family tree on one side and the list of tithables on the other, this single piece of paper really displays the multiplicity of genealogical meanings. Genealogy could be deeply emotionally meaningful, representing family relationships and inheritance relationships, indeed, which of course I think is part of why Washington was so genealogically literate and other people of his era. But in Washington's Virginia, it also represented another kind of inheritance, which is heritable racial slavery. And there were other places on Mount Vernon and in others of the Washingtons' holdings where enslaved people's family relationships were accounted. So it's not just that list of tithables. It's a regular practice of articulating enslaved people's relationships one to the other, and thus, in fact, confirming the fact of their inheritance of enslaved status. So that striking and specific feature of genealogy in British America, which was different from Britain, that I've already mentioned in regards to Washington, is genealogy across the divides of race and freedom. And Washington is not the only founder who was interested in genealogy, or who, of course, enforced heritable slavery and thus was invested in genealogical thinking in that dimension. In fact, it was quite literally impossible for me to find a single one of the founders who wasn't interested in genealogy in some way. And so many of them enslaved people that they were invested in this other dimension as well. So I've just showed you two quick examples here. On the top row, what you see is from Thomas Jefferson's family, his mother's Bible family record of the Jefferson family. In the middle is Thomas Jefferson's own family record in this prayer book. And then on the right, where Thomas Jefferson recorded the names of his children, with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was his dead wife's half-sister. And below this, you see one of the many examples I've seen from other kind of enslaving families where within, unlike where I just showed you with Jefferson, enslaved families' genealogies and the enslaving families' genealogies are existing in separate places. There are many examples where I see them existing within the same volume or in the same pieces of paper. So this is just one example from down the road from Jefferson in Henrico County of the Godwin family. The enslaving family's genealogy is on the left there, and the enslaved family on the right, Jim, the son of Aim, and Ben, the son of Aim. Genealogy really, really mattered. It was not a matter, as Chernow said, of leisure, curiosity, or vanity. It was consequential. But what about people who asserted their lineages and didn't only have it told for them or extracted from them? There's so many cases of people who were asserting their lineage in the context of claiming their freedom in freedom suits or also in manumission cases. And that just showing you just one example here from Martha Thompson of Westmoreland County up in the northwest part of Virginia, who claimed here her mother was a free woman and thus was lawfully married. And what Martha Thompson tells us there is a family history, a family lineage that would have confirmed her own right to freedom. There's so many cases that I read that I continue to use this one because I think if I have to choose another, there's so many hundreds that are so important. I'll just say that what Martha Thompson says here, my mother was free and was lawfully married, is just one example of the kind of ways that people articulated their family relationships. I've seen a case where a woman in Maryland in the early 18th century brought in a Bible record that her mother, who was an indentured servant, who became free and then married a Black man. So this woman was mixed race, but she said, my mother kept this Bible record to show that she was a free woman and thus I would be free. And there are cases where neighbors are attesting to the freedom of an ancestor to confirm the freedom of their descendants. And there are other contexts of people's extracted genealogies. I'm asked a lot about the British American style of genealogical reckoning and what that means, that Protestantism, monarchy, and the law, like what that requires in terms of genealogical reckoning and how to think about people, whether it's other kinds of European traditions or indigenous traditions of kinship reckoning and recounting, or African and African descended people. And I'll just say that what I was most interested in here is showing how a British American style of genealogy was deeply important to think about. And it was important for people to know and understand the legal consequence of it and be able to represent their genealogy and their family relationships that way. Not all of their family relationships, but in fact, the lineal ones that would be consequential. Thus, that's why people in the case of freedom suits are talking about lineal relationships and not collateral relations. And in indigenous cases, we see fairly regularly in court cases contesting land, just for example, in both this case, this is Jane Gibson, this is a freedom suit case in Virginia. And in this case of Uncas and the dispute around territory for the Mohegan in Connecticut, again, this kind of representation of lineal relationships. So that was a super quick introduction to some of the work that I'm trying to do in the book. And I will absolutely enjoy talking with you about the importance and the power of genealogy. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that great overview. One of the things, just to kind of start us off, so when I was teaching at a university in Chicago a couple of years ago, I had a great student who was really interested in genealogy in the 20th century, and particularly about the digital age. And she was really fascinated by how the software programs that we use bake in the expectations of how genealogical information is shared, how it's displayed, you know, who, the first wife might be, or the first spouse. Well, actually, in the whole heteronormative part of it, right? I mean, there is so much that the technology of recording genealogy, almost, the biases, we might say, are almost there because of the way of the material constraints of the software. You're taking us back to the 18th century, and you showed us some printed forms, but I'm curious, was there a culture of, here's how to make your family tree? Was there ways in which that this almost regime of recording was kind of imparted into British audiences, or were people more creative, in the way they kind of displayed that?
So there are a couple different questions embedded in that, and one has to do with formats, and one has to do with technologies, and then one has to do with cultural expectations and structures. And let me take the last one first, which is to say that a big part of the work that I did for this book and that I saw in the 18th century was showing how those cultural expectations of accounting lineal relationships and prioritizing lineal relationships, because those are the ones that in Bible, king, and common law, those are those lineal ones, no matter how important those collateral relations could be and those broader kin relations could be, and in some contexts would come into practical implication. It was the lineal relations that were emphasized always. So it's that expectation of the lineal relationship that I think is so important to understand. And that's so that expectation, while the kind of the formats and the technology is different, the expectation is the same. And oddly, it's that same expectation about lineage that you see in a lot of the software and a lot of the structuring formats. So the printed family record is really important part of the story, because people often ask me, like, how many family Bibles did you have to look at? I mean, and the answer is thousands. but family Bibles were not the main repository for family records in the 18th century, because Bibles were super expensive. As you know, they were printed in England and imported. And until really the 1790s, you don't get American Bibles. And it's not until the 19th century when you get really affordable American Bibles. But the thing that happens almost instantly when those American Bibles are affordable is that they create in the back of the Bible a printed family record page or pages. And those are absolutely structured like with lines, and it's like marriage, birth, death. And so the structure of that particular format is, I think, so telling. And that's a story of print technology, but mostly I think it's a story of those cultural expectations.
So first question comes from John Putnam, who wonders if you could just share your kind of research method in finding these very unique historical genealogical documents. Can you just type into the catalog family tree and it all?
Well, it is interesting, because I did work on this for a long time. And I'm happy to say that my research strategy, and that's such a good question, by the way, but my research strategy changed and had to adapt as we have more digital resources. So there was a moment, I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2012, 2013, when the Tennessee Bible Project went online. And I remember, like, it was huge, because Tennessee and Kentucky both had been a little bit like opaque to me, because in the primary historical societies and the state archives, I hadn't been able to see that there was much for me to go see. But once the Bible Project was online, I could quickly sort through and then lift up those that were actually of 18th century relevance. So there is a way that my research strategy was able to change and adapt. as we all know, we're all absolutely beholden to cataloging, which is the infrastructure of knowledge. And when cataloging didn't prioritize genealogy or family history as a subject, you're a little bit lost. So here's an example of something that I learned to do early, which was to look at account books, which I knew from just seeing a few, because my first research strategy was just go look at everything. But I knew that people were not putting their family histories in Bibles. Instead, they were putting them in the middle or at the end in the flyleaf of account books. And so I knew if I went someplace, so I famously, in my own mind, did this at the Connecticut Historical Society, and looked at all of their 18th century account books. They have a lot, because I could just look. And a lot of them had family history, but almost none of them at that time had those family records or genealogies as subject headings or in the card catalog. Yeah, so there's been a lot of change and adaptation over time. What I do now when I go into a library or special collections and I'm interested in finding genealogy or family history, these early ones, I do a kind of multi-pronged approach. And one is, of course, I go to the online catalog and look for those subject headings. But the other is I ask for account books. I see if there are early Bible records. And then I ask the folks who are working there, who were the local historians? And I go look for their stuff. Because that's the last most important point, is that so little is extant from the 18th century comparatively, but a lot of it exists as kind of ghost material in 19th century work. A lot of local family histories, local and/or family histories from the 19th century will reference or even sometimes reproduce transcriptions of 18th century materials that's no longer extant.
And I think you've given us some fantastic tips for those of us looking for family records in places we might not have anticipated. So thank you. So Eric Seaman, a great friend of the library, asks,
hello, Eric.
Can you discuss exceptions to the rule of patrilineality? Are there, what about examples of matrilineality on gravestones, women keeping their names after marriage? And is there a significance to these exceptions?
Of course, that's a great question. I would expect nothing less. I think Eric and I were on a panel together a really long time ago when he was probably 2 books ago. And I was thinking about the role of death in particular in creating kind of ancestral connection. And Eric's own work, of course, was really helpful to me on that, as so much else. So matrilineality is really an interesting question. The chapter on matrilineality, matriarchy, was the hardest chapter to write, because I feel like, so first of all, because maternity is fully embedded in heritable slavery, because maternity is articulated as opposed to the British system of patriarchy and patrilineality. And yet there's so many odd cases where it is maternity that is determining. I had to kind of figure out for myself what I thought about how potent maternity is as a kind of structuring family experience and family history, apart from some examples of people emphasizing their maternal lineage. So the short answer to this is that maternal lineage is really important in terms of cases of illegitimacy, bastardy, and in fact, that's in some ways the source of heritable slavery attached to maternal lineage. But there are plenty of exceptions to people doing patrilineal family histories, and people do them for all kinds of different reasons. Women don't marry, and they choose to articulate a family history that includes their aunts and their nieces, for example. People find authority in their mother's family line that they don't find in their father's. Jefferson and Adams are both great examples of that. John Adams famously goes to his vice presidential inaugural riding in a coach with his mother's Boylston coat of arms. How gauche. Poor John. But he, like Jefferson, his mother's family was more recognized, was more important, was more powerful, was richer, all of these things. That's a case. And then, the last thing I'll say about this is that in the kind of research I've done since I finished the book, one thing I've been really interested in pursuing is unmarried moms who go to court to talk about their baby's fathers. And I've got a kind of sample set from a Massachusetts county in the 1780s, and hearing and seeing how family histories are articulated in that context is utterly fascinating and not what I would expect at all.
There's a question from an anonymous attendee, which I think dovetails with this, and taps on both your knowledge in doing this work, but also as one of our important women's historians. What do you do when do you have any advice for those who are doing this kind of research and run into the roadblock of not finding the maiden names? Has your research, suggested any alternative strategies that, or is it just the cultural expectations?
It is so hard. It is so hard and so frustrating. So the first thing I would say is I have great empathy for your experience. And I think it's also worth just like naming that as an ongoing problem. Like, it's really useful to say that is one of our experiences, and it's not just an experience of trying to do genealogy, and it's not just an experience of the family then. It is a socially structuring expectation that women become invisible in the public record. And only in some cases can you actually find them, track them. I found, obviously I was, not trying to do the family history for everyone I encountered. But, there were individual cases where, if I just stayed at it for long enough and then tried to do something else and come back to it, I had a lot of luck. So honestly, I'm a big proponent of just like, take a break from it and come back to it, weirdly. And I mean, I know anyone who's done this work knows that, especially if you're relying on Ancestry and Family Search, there's a lot to be said about those databases. But sometimes you search it one way one day and you search it just slightly differently another day, and all of a sudden something comes to you. And then lastly, I would say, go to your local historical societies and your local libraries, because the rich material that's available there, including the knowledge of the folks who are working there, just can't be beat.
100%. Wonderful question here from Delisa Hawks, who writes, in the book you say that, quote, genealogy was the foundation of Virginia's racialized economy of property. She guesses to your last point, could we further say, instead of just genealogy, linear genealogy? Could you speak more to how African and African American and Indigenous approaches to kinship challenged British America's linear approach? Are there some interesting examples that might combine these two approaches? The intersection of these.
Yeah, that's a completely great question. I mean, in the book, as I said, I was interested in showing how this particular model of genealogy is really an instrument of power. It's also, I mean, genealogy wears these two faces, I think, and it's still true now, which is that it is this deeply meaningful practice that people really take a great deal of emotional succor from, I think, making family connections and exploring family connections. But it is also absolutely something that the state has been interested in from before the beginning. So it has always been a matter of deep public interest as well as private interest. And that public interest is in the form that I'm talking about. And the private interest can take different, have different dimensions to it, including different cultural expectations, like African interests in different kinds of kinship accounting and different kin practices, 100%, and super interesting. And I think when we look at, for example, what little we know about African burial practices in colonial British America, we see more kind of lateral attention than lineal attention, for example. But it is that insistence on that British American style, that extracted British style of accounting, that I think is important to contend with.
I think one of the things that I've really taken from this book is, if genealogy is a political act, is the identification with fictive kin, is the identification with matrilineal descent an even more radical act
Hmm.
as a result. And you know, I might be just bringing a more presentist kind of way of thinking that in our minds that we are looking for more transgressive approaches, you know, as political acts in themselves. But
Yeah.
would you encourage a graduate student or a family historian to think about the ways in which they kind of try to push back against the mold as something,
Yeah.
as a moment worth really exploring?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think there are moments where we might be able to see that. So, for example, when you see um, examples of, well, let's take a very famous example that many of us will be familiar with that Laurel Ulrich wrote about, Hannah Barnard's cupboard, for example, this beautiful piece of furniture that was passed down from Hannah to Hannah, who had different names, except Hannah, the first name, and passed down through many generations. And that's a form of women's property that held extremely valuable property, textiles, and a form of wealth that was kind of subverting the expectation of real estate to pass down from man to man. So, is it transgressive? Is it alternative? It is certainly alternative.
Mhm.
I think I see so many ways in which women collaborate with the kind of regime of genealogy, and it's most obvious with enslaving women who seem perfect, I mean, just utterly unwilling to think about how heritable slavery and their own practices of genealogy could be seen as in conflict. They, in fact, see them as synchronous.
Nice question here from Dan McCannon, who's going to be speaking next month on the 200th history of Unitarianism. So nice to have you with us, Dan. And so he says, thank you, Karin. You've shown many examples of genealogical record keeping. I know that in the 19th century, many New Englanders used these records to tell meaningful stories about who they were and what they valued. Did 18th century people also engage in the practice? And he then in parentheses writes, I assume this is what Chernoff was saying that Washington did not do.
Yeah, no, Chernow read Washington writing back to Isaac Hurd saying, well, I don't know, and didn't bother reading the rest of it. That's what happened. And he brought that's what I think. And he brought his bias about like, surely Washington was too busy, you know. But to your question about like, did people use genealogy to kind of fill out some kind of larger story about British America or about their own kind of regional identity? And all I would say is 100% yes. Like we only have to look at like Cotton Mather, Magnalia Christie is like the big. It's like it's like a genealogical history of New England, right? But that's true all the way along. Like you think about 18th century, whether it's 18th century Quakers, reiterating the importance of having been the early Pennsylvanians, the 17th century Pennsylvanians, or you think about like there are just so many dimensions that 18th century genealogical thinking um, not just helped authorize and narrate these kinds of stories about people's understanding of who they were, but were the essential components of it.
And this may be a question that sort of follows on from Megan Constantine, writes, thanks so much for a great talk. I wonder if you've noticed
Hi,
any
Megan.
gender, everyone on here today, any gender divisions in your exploration of 18th century British American genealogical practices. Are there gender divisions in the material or social historical context in which these records are created? I mean, is that a way of asking, do women do genealogy different than men in the 18th century?
I know. I wish there was a clear answer to that. It's so funny. There's a one of the guys from one of these Quaker families that I did a kind of whole lot of work on said in like 1730 something. He said, "Oh, the women in our family are the best genealogists." And then turns around and writes these unbelievable family trees that he like sends off to Britain, and anyway. And I was like, well, what are they doing differently than you're doing? I see nothing there, and I can't even understand why you're saying that. You're very odd. I tried to push and wonder if he was an 18th century version of Chernow, but I don't think so. He's so invested in doing it. I think he was trying to give credit to his sisters who were doing genealogical work. Um, I would have liked to think that I could find real distinctions between the kind of genealogical work that women were doing and men were doing. But what I really saw was differences not in what men and women were doing, but in what is extant, what survives. And, you know, as we know, there are certain kinds of records that are still around and others that are not. So, for example, that family, there's a lot left from the men in that family and not nearly as much from the women.
Which is a wonderful way that kind of brings us back to the archive, right? And what is preserved and what isn't. And, you know, I think for every one of those big scrapbooks that you shared, right, where all the pieces have been gathered, there are many, many more scrapbooks that were never created, right?
Yeah.
And these pieces that they don't survive. But I think you've done such a fantastic job with the pieces that exist. Thank you so much, Karin, for sharing your wisdom and sharing this book with us.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you all for sharing your time with me.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you at the next
Take care.
program.